Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today has actually been dubbed by the media as the House of Horrors, and you'll find out why as we go out throughout the video, but it's actually the case of the Turpin family. This was a suggested case by Heather, so thank you very much for that. I appreciate the suggestions that all you guys have, so do keep them coming in. I'd just like to let you know that I mean no disrespect whatsoever for anyone I'm going to talk about today. I've gathered the information off the internet and compiled it into one video for educational purposes. It was on the 14th of July in 2018, so not that long ago really, when a 17-year-old girl rang the police stating that she'd escaped from this house in Perris, Southern California, America. Now, Perris was quite an unremarkable middle-class suburb where you just wouldn't ever suspect anything untoward going on. She then went on to state that herself and her 12 siblings had been held captive. They were abused and tormented by the people that should have cared about them the most, their parents, which was David and Louise Turpin. David Allen Turpin was born on the 17th of October in 1961. Louise Anna Turpin was born on the 24th of May in 1968. They both did attend the same high school, but there was 8 years between them two. So they obviously wouldn't have been there at the same time. The pair actually met when Louise was just 10-year-old and David was 17. Now Louise did suffer abuse when she was younger, so at the age of 16, she decided that her and David would elope. She would finally escape from the abuse that she'd suffered and she would just go. So in 1985, that's what she did. They moved to Perrysburg, Virginia. David was a computer engineer who ended up working for Virginia Tech. He also works for companies like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics, before he went on to retire in 2012. David was also very much described as being quite a geeky guy. He was quite high paid in these jobs and the family did go on to live a comfortable life. Louise was said to have been sexually assaulted from being quite a young age. Apparently she was often sold along with her sister to wealthy child abusers who would go on to abuse them regularly. So they went on to have many children together, and David's parents said this was because God called on them to do so. In the space of 15 years, they had 8 children, which they would raise with military precision. They would often dress their children in military clothing. And from the outside, the Turpin family was this wealthy, successful, happy family. And I believe initially they probably were. Louise's brother and sister thought often that Louise had the perfect family life. And basically she got whatever she wanted. They were all very happy together. They had a decent wage coming in. So they wanted to go on holidays or anything like that. They just went because they could afford it, so why not? Like I said, on the outside, they were a normal, happy family. That was until something changed in 1998. Both the pair suddenly started to withdraw from the outside world and their own family and friends. They were very much keeping themselves inside the house and things like that, and that was because they were secretly bankrupt. Now, going from having a decent lifestyle, pretty comfortable, being able to do whatever you wanted, to completely bankrupt with no money whatsoever must have been really, really hard. It must have been so difficult, and my heart does go out to them for that. But what they did to their children is never excused. Louise was abused as a young one. Doesn't mean that she should have done the same to her children. It's just horrendous. So although yes, I do feel for them having lost all their money and things like that, it never excuses them to do what they actually did. So they also began homeschooling all of their, at the time, 8 children. And I believe family members and friends did think it was a little odd, but not too much into it really. But there was a more sinister reason for this, and that was because they began abusing their children. And the fact that they weren't sending them out to school anymore, to public school, would be their cover. They could then hide if they had hit one of them or left a mark on one of them or anything like that. they could hide it because they weren't going out into the public. No one was seeing them. I believe this was a major factor into why they were able to get away with it for so long. So the Turpins didn't allow any of the family members to come over anymore, but they did allow video calls and things like that so that they could still speak to the children. But her sister and brother would never ever get to see their nieces and nephews in person, only over video, and that was only for a limited time because she did eventually stop that as well. So obviously they were concerned over their weight, yes, but Louise and David would post tons of pictures on Facebook and social media of them basically being this one big happy family. It's also believed that in the video calls, it's possible that the way she dressed the children, maybe in baggy, frumpy clothes so that you couldn't really see how much weight they'd actually lost, was a major factor into her brother and sister not really thinking too much of it. Like I said, they just didn't know. And who would assume that? Who would assume that your own sister would go on to abuse her children? Nobody would ever think that of anybody. And it's just awful to even think about it, that your own sister would do something like that. When they did begin to actually ask questions, that was when the Turpins just completely cut any visual ties to them. They wouldn't answer any video calls, they just wouldn't allow it because basically they were asking too many questions and they didn't want anybody to find out what they were doing. They would still speak on the phone, however, but just like I said, there'd be no visual contact. From 1988 to 2015, the Turpins would go on to have 10 daughters and 3 sons, which was a total of 13 children. And they chose their children's names that they wanted them all to begin with the letter J. Louise would be consumed by alcohol and gambling. She had also become obsessed with witchcraft, satanic rituals, and Ouija boards. In 2016, Louise's parents actually died, and on their deathbed, they asked for her to come visit, and she just didn't. She didn't even go to the funeral, but I do believe that her husband David attended both of their funerals. In the late 1990s, the family moved from Fort Worth, Texas to Rio Vista in Johnston County. By the year 2000, David and Louise and their 8 children were living in a very different house of horrors. They were even more isolated from their family, who would never see them in person once more. And it was kind of the perfect place where they lived, really, because the houses were very spread out. They had huge fenced off areas of land and big gardens in between. So your neighbours weren't in close proximity. They couldn't really spy on what you were doing and things like that, and they just got all away with it. And behind this facade, the neglect and abuse just got worse. Ricky and Shelley Vineyard were the neighbours that lived across from them, basically. And when they moved in, they thought they were getting a great set of neighbours. But even with the distance between the houses, they did initially think something was wrong. The daughters would go over and play with the kids because none of the other children would. They used to say things like they smell and things like that, and they were weird and whatever else, whatever kids say when it comes to that. But her daughter actually would go over and play with them. They were allowed to play together at first until things became odd. On one occasion, one of the older girls was out and Shelley went over and she noticed that her hands were so white. They were that bad that she actually thought she had gloves on. But they weren't. Her hands were just that white through, I'm guessing, the lack of sun and things like that. Not only that, they were kind of white, sort of the wrist upwards. And when she asked her, when she actually said, "I thought you had gloves on then," the girl said something along the lines of, "If you wash past your wrists, you're wasting water." So that's what her parents had been telling her. Her hands were probably one of the cleanest part of her because the rest of her, by the looks of it, she wasn't able to wash. They didn't allow it. That could have potentially been why the children, other children who didn't want to be friends with them, would say that they smelled. They did eventually move on in 2010 as suspicions were growing higher. They'd added another 4 children to the family, making it up to 12. Just before they moved, their abuse was actually almost discovered when their eldest child managed to run away. A neighbour actually went and picked them up, but because the child was so undereducated, they obviously didn't go to school, and I presume that the parents didn't do a very good job at actually homeschooling them because, well, they were abusing them. Why would they even care too much? But because she was so undereducated, the neighbour thought she actually had mental issues and that she was mentally challenged, something like that. So we just took her back to her parents. She tried to run away and he was just simply brought back. But because she couldn't communicate properly, she couldn't tell him because she was just that undereducated that she physically couldn't. And it's just so sad because that could have been where it was discovered. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So after they left, the neighbours went in. They found piles of garbage all around the house. They found dead cats all around the house. When they went inside, they instantly thought that it absolutely stunk in there. Pretty much everything in the house had a padlock on it. The cupboards, the doors, the fridge, everything had a padlock on it. The house was just completely locked down. They found feces, rats were jumping out everywhere. They found beds with ropes still attached to them, and the mattresses that were on the beds were basically that disgusting and old that they pretty much were disintegrating around them. And they basically rotted away, and that's horrendous. To even think that the 12 children at the time, that those conditions they were living in, oh, it was awful. This is when they moved to Paris, and the neighbours around them would describe the children as very withdrawn and only would speak when spoken to. They did also state that they did appear to be very, very pale and malnourished, but pretty much they didn't see them very often. They were only allowed outside a few times because they were very limited. Obviously, they were in a more populated area at the time. They didn't want any kids or any adults or anyone to realise what they were doing, so they didn't let the children go outside very often. By the time we get to 2018, the children have already been planning their escape for over 2 years now. On the 14th of January that year, 2 children actually managed to get out of the house, but the youngest of the 2 got too frightened and went back. Being only 13 at the time, it was just too much and they just went back. The other, who was 17, carried on, managed to put some distance between her and the house, and that's when she called the authorities.
Okay, I live in a family of 15 people, and my parents are abusing. They abuse us, and my 2 little sisters right now are chained up.
She'd taken a phone with her, and this was what she was able to use.
There's 13 kids, and then a mother and father.
And how many of your siblings are tied up?
2 of my sisters, 1 of my brothers.
How are they tied up, with rope or with what?
With chains. They're chained up to their bed.
She met up with the police officers and she showed them the photos of the conditions she was living in the house. She was quite smart on that front. She'd taken pictures of it all. She'd taken the phone out with her so she could call the police, and she had the proof and the images there for it because she was a 17-year-old girl. She was a minor, so the police would have been inclined to take her back. But she decided that she needed this proof to show them straight away so there wouldn't be any kind of disagreement as to what was actually happening. She said, speaking about siblings, that they would wake up in the middle of the night crying and asking her if she could call somebody. She said, I wanted to call y'all so y'all can help my sisters. These children grew up in an environment that was so controlled and so abusive. When the media discovered what the children had to do to survive and the conditions they endured and the abuse that they endured, that was when the California Paris home was dubbed the House of Horrors. Due to the depravity of this case, it gained national and international interest from the press, and the story was spread like wildfire. Pretty much got everywhere within such a short period of time. The children didn't spend all of the time locked away in captivity. Don't get me wrong, they spent most of it locked up. But there surfaced some pictures of David, Louise, and the 13 children at Disneyland. They'd gone to visit it. They were all wearing matching Disney tops. And I believe that Louise and David really, really loved Disney and they loved visiting Disneyland. But I do believe that these instances were very few and far between. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department went on to raid the house and they found evidence of prolonged abuse and horrific living conditions. And they found the other 12 children inside. One was actually chained to the bed and another two kind of had the appearance like they'd recently been chained, but they'd obviously been released. Now, this case is horrific. What these people did to their children is just unforgivable. So the officers actually thought that none of the children were over the age of 18. And this was because they were so malnourished. Their growth was so stunted. They hadn't had the nutrients and things that they needed in their life. That they were all very small and very thin, and they just didn't look like any of them were over the age of 18. It actually came to light that 7 of them were over the age of 18. 7 of those children were over the age that the police didn't even think that they would remotely make because of the condition that they were in. And it was actually learned that David and Louise had planned to move to Oklahoma just before their arrest. I guess they thought the suspicions were growing too high. That's what they did. They lived in an area for so long, they abused their kids for so long, and when suspicions grew, they moved on. So that was the plan again. Now, the police actually said that Louise was utterly baffled as to why they were there. Now, I don't really understand that. Did she really think that what she was doing there was nothing wrong with? I don't understand that myself, but that's what they said. Going back to the children, one of the children was actually a 29-year-old woman. She was the eldest of all of the children, and she was so underfed and unhealthy that her muscle growth had basically stagnated. She literally weighed 5 stone 8, or 82 pounds, as some people like to say it. They also found hundreds of journals written by the children depicting their lives. Now, the things about these cases is that this becomes that children's normal. Now, the really sad thing about this is that the victims in these kind of cases, to them, this is their life. These victims become so accustomed to this way of life that they just think that it's normal. So if they're conditioned like this from day one, it's more likely that they would never actually say anything to anyone, or that they would never try and get any help, because they might think that this was a normal thing to happen within a family. And they believe that it is normal because it's their normal. And that's just so sad. In the house, there was feces everywhere. They very rarely let the kids go to the toilet, so they just made them do it anyway. The stench of this, along with the rotten animals that was in the house, must have been utterly disgusting. They were also chained and padlocked or tied with ropes frequently to the beds. Seriously, guys, it's so horrific what they had to endure. They were fed once a day, and they were allowed to shower once a year. Once a year to shower. I couldn't even imagine that. They must have been filthy.
We live in filth, and sometimes I wake up and I can't breathe because how dirty the house is.
When was the last time you had a bath?
I don't know, almost a year ago. But sometimes I feel so dirty. I wash my face and I wash my hair.
For years, their parents had imprisoned them. They beat them. They even strangled them at some points. And their abuse only got worse. Most of the children didn't even have any knowledge of the outside world. They didn't know what medicine was. They didn't know what a hospital was. They didn't even know what the police were.
Were you homeschooled?
No, we don't do school. Our mother tells people we're homeschool. Our mother tells people we're private schools. And she has a fake private school set up. But we don't really do school. I haven't finished first grade and I'm 17.
Their 17-year-old had the IQ of a child. They were totally isolated with no friends and no family. able to come in and visit them. These parents abused and tortured their children, and it was both parents and all of the children. And it was considered extraordinary by the outside world for these reasons, because it was just utterly horrific.
I don't know much about my mother. She doesn't like us. She doesn't spend time with us ever.
When the children were rescued, the ages were from 2 to 29, so their youngest child was 2. They went on to spend several weeks in hospital recovering. After this, 6 of the minors were put into 2 foster homes. And the elder ones were helped along the way to try and just build up their lives again and just get on with their lives. In 2020, the Riverside County District Attorney said that some of the children were living independently in their own flat apartment, some had jobs, some were going to school, some went out into volunteer in the community, and many of them do go to church. One has also since graduated college. So it does seem that despite all the torment and the stunted growth and the stunted education and things like that, that they did manage to rebuild their lives and kind of start anew and educate themselves, go out into the world, get jobs, and just live their lives like they should have been doing all along. On the 22nd of February in 2019, David and Louise changed their plea to guilty to avoid a trial. They'd proclaimed their innocence all the way through, but they wanted to avoid a long and drawn out trial, so they changed it to guilty. This included 1 count of torture, 3 counts of willful child cruelty, 4 counts of false imprisonment, and 6 counts of cruelty to an adult dependent. David and Louise Turpin were sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Experts have actually said that they will most likely never receive parole due to the severity of their crimes, so that essentially would make their sentence a life sentence. Their families were utterly shocked to find everything that had been going on. Like I said earlier, they did have suspicions, but you never ever really think that your sister, your brother, your son, your daughter would ever do anything like that, especially not to their own children. And they do carry a lot of guilt over it, which is quite heartbreaking. Louise's sister and brother have been on camera and things like that and given their statements and opinions and everything, and they do carry guilt over it, which you would. They shouldn't blame themselves because they weren't to know. I mean, they weren't aware of the abuse. If they were, they would have reported it. Her sister even said in one interview that even though she did suffer abuse and things like that, she doesn't want to give her an excuse for what she did, because there is no excuse for what she did. And I don't really believe that her sister could ever forgive her. Now, please don't take that as me saying that her sister won't ever forgive her, because obviously I'm not her and that is up to her. But the way that she was speaking, that's what it would seem like. It's just utterly horrendous what happened in the House of Horrors. But I am very thankful that that brave 17-year-old girl decided to do what she did. She decided that she was going to save her family. Her younger brothers and sisters, and even her older ones, were asking her to call somebody. They were crying all the time. They were living a horrible existence. And she actually took it upon herself to save them, which she did. She was so brave, and who knows how long it would have gone on if she hadn't have done that. If it wasn't for her courage, it could have gone on for many years more. My heart really does go out to all of those involved. And I'm so thankful that these children were able to get out. They were able to go to new lives. And yes, some did end up in foster care and things like that. But hopefully they found a happy, loving family. And it was so far from what they received. They can get a good education. They can just start their lives anew. And I'm just so thankful that they're able to do that. If you guys have any suggestions you'd like me to look into, please do let me know and I will look into them for you. Anyway, guys, that's all I have today on the case of the Turpin family. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.